probably the best change I've made in the last decade is I'm no longer afraid of emotions. I recognize them for what they are. I allow them to be. I don't try to fight them. And I expect that things will get better. I've learned that I think we carry with us in our stories whatever we need to protect us from what's about to come. I think we carry in our stories whatever we need to heal ourselves. And the best work is the work that allows those stories to unfold.
You're listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. Join us as we explore tools, practices, meditations, and conversations with members of the UK community. Together, we'll discover how we can thrive at work, home, and beyond. Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of Becoming Wildly Resilient. I'm your host, Jakob Hester, and I'm so glad you're here. The voice you heard at the beginning is my guest for this episode, Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr. Willie is an academic advisor for the UK College of Business and Economics. He's also an author and advocate, which you'll learn more about in our conversation. Throughout our chat, you'll hear how Willie has put his values into action and what that's taught him about resilience along the way. He talks about his experiences as a gay Appalachian, the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year, and connecting with folks near and far as an advocate. Willie also shares tips for being a better ally and reads one of the poems from his new book, Gay Poems for Red States, which was published in June 2023 by the University Press of Kentucky. Before you get into my conversation with Willie, I also want to let you know that I have a big announcement to share at the end of the episode. Be sure to listen to the recap to hear about the changes coming to the Becoming Wildly Resilient podcast. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr. Welcome, Willie. So glad to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's absolutely an honor.
Can you first talk just a little bit about your role here at UK and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm an academic advisor in the Undergraduate Resource Center at Gatton College of Business and Economics. It's a great position because the primary function is helping students. And what I really like about it is, even though I'm in business and economics, my role is really sort of the forward-facing part of the university in terms of helping students. So I always tell students, I'm sort of your person here. So yes, you're a business student, but if you call me tomorrow and say, hey, really thinking about it, I want to do ballet, like I'm going to help you find ballet classes. If you say, hey, I don't even know that I want to go to college anymore, I'm here to talk to you about that. Whatever your sort of issue is, it doesn't have to be that I'm trying to force you to stay in business. Although most of our students are very happy in business, and that also brings me joy because it's a new world for me. I don't have a business background, and seeing how many students are really taking the idea of business in lots of interesting ways that really focus on social justice was not what I expected. So I like being a part of that. I like feeding off their energy, seeing what they want to do with their lives.
Yeah, we've talked about helping professions quite a bit on the show in the past, and it's always amazing to me how many things could be classified as a sort of like a helping position across the university, and the number of folks that I think just by the nature of what we do, I think you could pretty much say our entire employee population in some way is some kind of helping profession, or at least has the capacity for that, just based on the jobs that we do and the people that we interact with and things like that. So it's really cool to hear. But you mentioned not having the business background and kind of getting here. Can you kind of talk about your path to this role?
Yeah, so I left teaching a little over a year ago. It was interesting because I was the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year, but teaching is hostile to LGBTQ people at the moment. And I was in one of the most hostile counties. And I fought for a long time to sort of maintain a space there. I knew my space was important for students, but it got to be where it wasn't emotionally safe for me to be there, and it wasn't safe for my students to be there. So I had no idea what to do. So I actually spoke to a career counselor at Morehead State, which is where I did my undergraduate. And we did a lot of assessments, and she was like, wow, you really are interested in data keeping and numbers. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Almost like it was offensive. And she goes, no, you've scored really high. And I go, well, yeah, but that's because I like things to be neat and orderly, and I like to know where things are. And she was like, have you thought about student support services? And from that point, I applied to a few places, was absolutely thrilled to see the open position at UK and specifically in Gatton, because I knew that it was going to be something new for me. I knew that I could bring what I had and grow as well. And it's definitely been that.
Yeah, I think that experience of teaching probably helps you quite a bit as those students transition from high school into college too, I would imagine.
For sure. We have a sort of introductory spill when students come in for BBNO, and I only see high school students when they're sitting in front. I think everyone else sees new college students. I see current high school students, so that's how I approach them. I lead with talking about myself as a guidance counselor, and I explain every little concept that I know they don't know, like credit hour. I know because we would have people come speak in the high school, and then they would leave. And then all the questions that those students should have asked those people, they would suddenly ask the teachers.
Yeah.
And I know what their anxieties are. I know what their hopes are. And so it's easy for me to talk to those things.
Yeah. So what about you outside of work, kind of the non-work Willie?
The non-work Willie at this point, I think, is advocate Willie. So funny thing is I have these giant rainbow glasses that I'm not currently wearing, but they're also sort of my profile pic. They're a complete accident. I wore them because my contacts wouldn't go in one day. And it was the first day that I was meeting the other 55 teachers of the year. And I quickly threw these glasses on that I had bought as sort of a joke because I needed to spend another $6 to get a discount. And everyone remembered who I was. And I was like, okay, this is a thing. I'm going to be the guy in the giant rainbow glasses. And so I do a lot of advocacy work. I work with the Kentucky Youth Law Project. I work with Campaign for a Shared Future. I work with Progress Kentucky. So I feel like if I'm not working at this stage, I'm advocating for Appalachian, Black, Brown, and LGBTQ youth. Or I'm reading, or I'm writing. I'm also in an MFA program right now, so that takes up a lot of my time. But I don't know how to have free time and hobbies. My husband's really good at it. He can just sit on the couch and stare at the ceiling for 6 hours and talk about how calm he is. And the thought of it makes me itch. If there's free time, I want to do something.
Based on everything you just listed, I can't imagine that you have a whole lot of free time anyways. I don't know how you sleep. I think I'm probably more like your husband. I like to find rest, and I can find it pretty much anywhere. I used to be able to say I could sleep anywhere if I needed to.
I'm jealous of that. I did take a nap. So I do about one a year. It's just my body doesn't do that. I try to nap, and then I start to get really stressed and panicky. But I think we had been on the go for like 12 days. And every time that I thought I would get to be home, something else would prevent me from being home. But I was home, no one was there, and it was noon. And my body said sleep. And I slept for like 2 hours. And I'm literally talking about a nap on a podcast. But I'm telling you, it was the best nap ever. So yeah, it's rare for me.
Yeah. It can be tough to convince yourself to slow down sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad to hear in that example that you listen to your body too,
Mm-hmm.
And recognize the signals and said, okay, I really don't like to do this normally, but it's
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
My body's saying it's time, let's do it. So this kind of leads, I guess, into our conversation a little bit. So what would you say your top 3 or so values are?
I did a training last year, and we did there were like 42 values, and we had to slowly mark away values until I got 3 that were completely unlike anyone else's, and then I felt like an outsider. But I think my top values are probably courage, vulnerability, and kindness. We don't talk a lot about vulnerability, but I've known for a long time, probably from RuPaul, honestly, that vulnerability it's sort of an invitation. And I didn't really understand all the nuances of that until Andy Bashir came to Mount Sterling. I think a local hospital was getting a check or something. And he actually pulled me to the side, and I was honored that he even remembered my name. But he said, what you're doing, Willie, is going to be such difficult work, and you need to forgive yourself if it's not working well. He said, because there's a lot of people right now who are trying to scare people and trying to get them to put on armor, but you're trying to get them to take it off and say, trust me, be kind to me, love me. And I've been thinking a lot about how he was really talking about vulnerability too. So showing someone your heart means sort of exposing it, right? But I find that people respond very well to that. And courage just to do the right thing. I think most people aren't doing bad things. I think most people are just being quiet. But, I don't know who said it, but if you have a room with 49 quiet people and one Nazi, you have a room with 50 Nazis. So I try my best to speak out, especially when it's uncomfortable. And then kindness, because why not? Life's hard enough. Can't we just be good to each other?
Yeah, I like that. The vulnerability pieces, we've kind of touched on it in previous episodes as well, but there's tons and tons of research. Brene Brown, that's her big space on that. So I may drop a couple links in the show notes for folks if they want to explore that concept a little bit further.
And she's absolutely right. One of the things with this book that I really wanted to do was, I thought vulnerability is one thing. Asking children to be vulnerable is an entirely other thing. Right now, we're sort of seeing a war waged against LGBTQ children. We can't go to these children and say, be vulnerable. They're already vulnerable just by existing. We certainly can't ask them to make themselves more so. So I wanted to write a vulnerable collection from the perspective of who I was when I was a kid. And my hope was that people would respond by being vulnerable themselves and telling those stories. And it's worked. The number of people who've sort of immediately wanted to share. The number of people who've written poems as a response and sent them to me is amazing. So yeah, I think vulnerability begets vulnerability.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think we'll dive into your book here in just a second as well. But how would you say that your values guide your purpose then? So taking courage, vulnerability, and kindness, how does it sort of drive your purpose in life?
I think it's about the worth of other people. I think I became a teacher, and I think most teachers become teachers because they believe that other people have worth. And there's a sort of instinct to recognize that dignity and help it grow to its full potential. And for me personally, I think the last probably decade of my life, it's been about extending that to myself. If you look at the teaching profession, it is by and large women. I've seen some research on it, but when you look at the number of men, they are much more likely to be LGBTQ than the rest of the population. I think a lot of people who needed someone in their lives to protect them, to tell them they were worthwhile, choose a profession where they can do it for other people, that they can tell other people that they have worth. And so I've discovered sort of how to speak to myself along that path. So vulnerability is a way of finding myself. Courage is a way of saying whatever I find is worth other people looking at or listening to. And kindness is a way of saying whatever mistakes that self has made, that self is still worthwhile.
I like that. That's really good. So let's dive into your book a little bit, because I think that's one of those ways that you've sort of put your values into action. And so the book is Gay Poems for Red States. It came out, in May of 2023? Is that right?
It's a little June 6th, so I think we're only a month out.
Oh, wow.
Although the first copies were sent in May.
That's amazing. Yeah, so it's still really, really fresh for you. I know we were talking right before we got going here, the sort of book tour that you've done, how many interviews that you've done just about the book. So I appreciate you carving a little bit of time out just to do this. But can you tell our listeners just a little bit more about the book and what spurred it on?
Sure. So the Teacher of the Year in the state of Kentucky gets a sabbatical of 6 months. And it was during that sabbatical that I really had a lot of time on my hands to do whatever I wanted. I love that about the way the state of Kentucky does it. There's really no work put on the teacher other than to let them sort of shine. And if you compare Kentucky Teachers of the Year to other Teachers of the Year, you'll actually find that we're much more outspoken. We actually find more work to do. So that part is really beautiful. And what happened was, because I am a gay man who is not ashamed of the fact that he is gay, who is never going to hide the fact that he is gay, that irked a lot of people. People who are in my community who otherwise had never noticed I existed suddenly were hyper aware. And the thought that I could be Teacher of the Year likely frustrated them. So they began attacking me. They were attacking my students. The attacks were pretty vile. It was the sort of go-to groomer narrative based upon no evidence other than the fact that I'm gay. But they also started attacking my students. They were sharing pictures of my students at their after-school jobs along with their names. Everyone was terrified. Parents of current students were emailing for support. I was emailing my school for support. And for some reason, the school refused to do anything, even speak to what my students actually were doing in their LGBTQ group, which was teaching themselves history. So long story short, I actually sat down to write an angry letter to my superintendent and I wrote a poem and kind of looked at it and thought, well, what was that? It was a poem about me going to McDonald's with my mom when I was 4 or 5. Had no idea sort of where it came from, but I recognized that this young person in me was upset. And so I spent the next few days actually writing. And what I found was this young person really wanted to talk about school, really wanted to talk about their experiences as a gender creative or LGBTQ person in school. And I think watching schools become less safe for our kids when schools were my safe place as a kid brought something out of him. So it's a collection of 40 or so vignettes. They're in narrative poem form. They kind of read something like stories in verse form. You could probably pull the spaces out of most of them and read them like prose. I wanted it to be something accessible, but also wanted to highlight Appalachia. The kid who was writing from Floyd County in the 90s. And there's so much beauty in how Appalachians put together words, put together ideas, that I wanted to capture that as best as I could. And so it became Gay Poems for Red States.
Yeah, I think I read the last 3 last night. I had been working on it in prep of our conversation here. And for me, I read a lot of different things, but I think when you're talking about that vulnerability, that was something that I wrote down ahead of time as what I read from this. And really that range of human emotions and all of those different little vignettes. You could hear joy, you could hear, deep sadness and fear and hope and most definitely resilience. But as you were going through that process, what did you go through as you went through writing?
I think above all else, I realized that there was this kid inside of me, and I didn't realize the extent to which I had silenced him or he had silenced himself so that I could live. Queer kids in the 90s didn't exactly have a space to exist, but he dreamt of one. He dreamt of a future. And so he stayed quiet and did whatever work he needed to do to get me here. And I think the pain of it, especially, I tried to probably forget subconsciously. And I realized just how much he remembered. Every smell, every texture, every feeling. They were all still very much there. And I discovered just how much I wanted him to be free. So that above all was the miraculous part for me. And I also thought a lot about how much other people must be carrying, how many of us have had a young fighter who kept us alive at his own expense. So my goal was to let him speak. In fact, it's hard coming at this too, having taught literature for 15 years. Socially, we sort of have this belief that anything that's too emotional is a problem, or that something shouldn't be too sweet or too sad or too evocative of sentiments. And there were a couple of lines that I would sort of write and I would think, wow, that's a lot. And I would go to erase them. I would put my hand over the backspace button and I could feel this kid say, do not erase me. Everyone erased me. And I wouldn't. I said, be as sentimental as you want. Sentimental means having feelings. He had feelings. Why should I mask those or dilute them so that they're palatable? This was a 7-year-old kid. His joy was very joyful and his sadness was very sad.
Yeah, I like this idea of giving that younger you space and freedom to, I guess, exist in the way that you always hoped and wanted to exist. Because it feels like you've done a lot of sort of deep reflection to get to that point. And I think part of that for you now, it sounds like, is going back in that time and saying, okay, I can't change that time, but I can give you space now to emerge. So was that like kind of a really cathartic feeling when you finished it?
Oh, for sure. And catharsis, in some ways, doesn't even begin to describe it, like what you said about holding space. A lot of it was about trying not to think while this was happening, as odd as that sounds. But I think about one poem, for example, Cornmeal and Water Pancakes. A person can look at this as a poem about poverty or a poem about hardship because we didn't have electricity and we had literally 2 ingredients in the house and we didn't have any other food. But at 7, that's not how I was seeing it. All I knew is my mom could do magic, and I was excited about that magic. So as I was writing it, I really just tried to let him feel his way out or through that experience. And yeah, so trying not to think about it through sociological lenses, trying not to think about it through, you can't write about Appalachia without upsetting someone. I'm actually shocked no one has been offended yet. Someone asked me in Dayton, Kentucky at a reading, were you nervous? And I was like, that was the scary part. The queer part, man, people can be upset at me or not. I'll get over it about whatever they might be upset about. But I feel like if anyone speaking any sort of truth to Appalachia is only speaking their truth. And it's such a big place. And it's so easy to make people feel unseen, even when you're seeing someone else. So that was actually the scary part of this. But so far, so good.
Yeah, we were chatting ahead of time. I have family that grew up basically pretty much down the road from where you grew up. So I kind of caught myself sort of knowing that world. I grew up here in Lexington, so it was not the world that I grew up in. I spent a lot of time there, and I obviously knew a lot of folks that were from there, spent a lot of time there, were still there, and spent a lot of summers there too. Mm-hmm. And so I could find myself sort of putting myself in your shoes. It was really a perspective taking type of activity for me as I was reading through, because I knew just enough. And for me, it didn't feel like that caricature that we get of Appalachia. And it felt, again, just reading it all the way through, it felt really sort of authentic and vulnerable to you without being disparaging to someone else, because the entire, evidence behind it is it's your stories and your experience. And I really enjoyed that about it. And I felt like the more that I read, the more that I started to kind of feel that prose, and I could tell it was not a conscious reading anymore. You kind of get into a really good flow as you go through. So I kind of read it in 2 different ways. I would read one, kind of think about it. And then I took a different approach and tried to read a few at a time to kind of get into a flow. And it was really interesting just to kind of see the reactions that I had, or kind of how I understood things, or just how immersed I started to kind of get into it based on the 2 different ways that I was trying to read it.
I love hearing you say that. I think especially that you're attempting 2 different ways, because you sort of had the 2 different lives, the one in Lexington, the one in Knott County. My approach to language, you might call it maximalist, but I just think of how people I know tell stories. And it's really like throwing wave after wave after wave at you. And the goal is to sort of let yourself be carried by it and not try to catch every single detail. I basically want to inundate people, and I want them not to try to catch every word. I want them to sort of feel it like water, I guess. And so the goal, in my mind, people should be reading these They can read them any way they want. I think there's value in lots of it. But I love the idea of people reading these quickly and just sort of capturing a feeling more so than anything. But yeah, my hope, this was the bet I made, is that I know I love Appalachia. I know how deep my love is. And I thought, if I'm writing truthfully, then I don't have to worry. I have a really clear memory of being in an art appreciation class. I was at Morehead State. And we're looking at some photography that was taken in the, I don't really remember, early 80s maybe. But it's basically babies in diapers standing in front yards of trailers, and there's cars up on blocks. And someone in the room was like, this is such an offensive stereotype. And I was actively thinking, this is my family. Not literally, but it might as well be. What's so offensive about us? Is it that you're offended that we're poor? Or is it that you don't see yourself here? I've never really come to a conclusion there. I think in all the discourse that I've seen about Appalachia, we gloss over that little tension between, I don't know, progressive people who want to show off the best parts of Appalachia, but who define the best parts outside of poverty. And obviously we don't want to list poverty as one of the best parts, but it's a human question. The people who are living in poverty are some of the best parts of Appalachia too. And we can't avoid poverty and show them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this will come full circle here towards the end of the conversation, but I'd like to get into a little bit of your advocacy work too, because you've done a lot for marginalized groups and you mentioned a little bit of it already. So can you talk about that work and your journey to it, some of the highlights of it maybe?
Yeah. So I spent 15 years in the classroom and I spent 14 years fighting. I think that was sort of my approach. I show up, okay, where will I see injustice today and how will I fight it? And I was almost always a winner in those fights because I knew the law. But that's how I approached my entire job, my entire sort of outlook. And when I was Teacher of the Year, there was this sudden new opportunity with all of these other Teachers of the Year. And I thought we should be doing bigger stuff and bigger fighting. And so I wrote a letter sort of opposing the anti-CRT legislation in the 2021 legislative sessions across the country. And in our little Zoom, because it was during COVID, I was like, hey, everybody, would you want to sign this? I put it up in the chat. Well, the parent company that sort of organizes all of this, because we go all over the country, we do big things, had their representative say she would like to call me. And I immediately am ready for this fight. And by this point, I've already contacted CBS. They're going to run a national story. I'm getting signatures. And she goes, well, do you have a media kit? And I go, it's fine. We know what we're doing. And she goes, okay, well, all right. What is your media plan long term? Have you all done some training? And I'm just giving her really curt responses. And she goes, I'm trying to help you, Willie. And I have this moment where I say to her, I can logically understand, but my body can't. My body is only trying to fight you right now. I need to get off the phone. And I got off the phone and literally started crying because I realized, okay, I'm entering into a new phase of these things. I'm now able to get help from people who have resources. And this is new for me because I feel like I've just sort of been at the bottom fighting. So anyway, long story short, I hear RuPaul in my head while I'm crying saying the universe wants you to succeed, which I've heard him say a million times, but suddenly I got it. It's not about not fighting. I mean, RuPaul is a Black drag queen born in 1960. He knows fights. It's about other people actually being the universe. And so I sort of went forward with that mentality and started attaching myself to groups, finding out where my natural interest could work. So immediately I reached out to the It Gets Better Project. I got a $10,000 grant from them. So we're building some LGBTQ libraries, and we're going to have a queer conference, which the state of Kentucky has now picked up. So that'll be sometime later in the fall, and that's going to be available to any and every LGBTQ or ally person in the state of Kentucky. I work with the Kentucky Youth Law Project. They're a fantastic group. Any LGBTQ person under the age of 25 who finds themselves in need of legal help, we do whatever we can do. I work with Campaign for Our Shared Future. It is run by a former education consultant to the Obamas, Ruth Ann Buck, and a former president of GLSEN, Eliza Biard. And together, they're focusing on saving our democracy. And they view education and resistance to fascism and censorship as sort of hallmarks of what that work looks like. So they've been really great in inviting me across the country to speak to sort of my experiences as an LGBTQ person in a rural red state. And then they've really helped get my message out about the sort of work that I'm doing and how we can help people. I work for Progress Kentucky. We have a similar goal to talk about issues relevant to minoritized groups. We do a weekly show. We get people to vote. We sign people up for voter registration. So there is no lack of work for anyone out there. I think so many people are interested in doing good, but just sort of think that they aren't well positioned or think that they won't have skills. So if I could change people's thinking on that, it would be the best thing possible. I joined Kentucky 120 United, American Federation of Teachers, and literally they wanted me to be in the advisors group. So it's sort of a group of people who help make decisions, and they do it very democratically. And I thought, well, who am I to be in this group? That's silly. I don't have anything to offer. And within 2 months, I was in the National LGBTQ Caucus. So I think it's the largest LGBTQ group, or the most powerful group of LGBTQ members in any union in the United States. So I'm putting myself out there and doing any sort of work that I can do, any event that I can speak at, anything that helps our democracy or helps the youth who are currently the victims in a culture war.
Yeah, your work has taken you to some of the highest levels. So if you just Google your name, you can see that you've been in front of the congressional committee. You had an opportunity, I believe, to go to the White House too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the funny thing when people say like your work. I was asked to prepare a speech for the 2023 Kentucky Teacher of the Year and to give it one piece of advice. I gave one word, which was speak. That is advocacy. I'm a linguistic nerd, so the voc in there means voice. Ad means to sort of go towards, and advocacy is lifting up voices. It's making a voice go further. And so all I started doing was talking and speaking and saying things out loud that a lot of teachers can't say because I was in a privileged position to do so. And so that meant saying our kids are in danger. We've got the numbers. LGBTQ youth are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to depression. They're vulnerable to suicidality. And we know this, and we know that the choices that we're making legally will harm them, period. They will harm them. And we allow it to happen because we place what we might call, I don't know, political fairness above the reality of children's lives. And to me, it's a no-brainer. I would rather speak up and maybe anger some people than let children die. And Jamie Raskin, who headed the January 6th committee, actually reached out via Twitter. It was like, would you like to testify? And I said, of course I'd like to testify. So that was a very beautiful experience. I had a reporter from Le Monde, it's the largest newspaper in France, just sort of reach out and say, I'm paying attention to what you're saying. Would you like to, we would love to fly a reporter from Le Monde to Mount Sterling, Kentucky, and do a profile, because the French don't understand what's happening. And you also speak French, so maybe you could speak to this. So that's what a lot of my work has been, and it's amazing how many people will respond if you just speak truth. So I've gotten to meet the president of the National Writing Project. I got to meet President Biden. I went to the Gill Foundation. It's a large charity organization that connects LGBTQ groups that do any sort of work that's important for our community with people who have resources, usually financial, who can help. And I got to be a keynote this year, and it was really amazing how many people came up and said, "Oh, I follow you online," as if they were excited to meet me. And I'm like, this isn't like the president of the HRC is like, "Oh, I know you," and I'm like, "How do you know me?" But yeah, it's been a great year. The vision that I have of sort of what's happening is, I'm standing in front of these doors and I'll say, I want this door opened, and people who can open it. And I think people are just waiting for someone to vocalize those things. Just this week, a mother in the county I live in reached out and said, hey, would you like to be in a dunking booth? So she wants to start a Special Olympics club because our county hasn't had one in 5 years. And one of the things that she found when she was like, okay, well, if no one can do this, I'll do it, because she wants her kid to be a part of something. She wants him to feel good in his body. She wants him to have the opportunity to be on a team. And she found out that the provided uniform was a t-shirt. And she was like, why doesn't my kid get a full uniform just like anyone else? So I was actually going to be out of the state the day that she did the dunking booth. So I said, okay, well, I'll make a little GoFundMe. So I made a little GoFundMe. And I spoke truth to why this matter, why these kids matter. And then suddenly there were $700 in it. And then a news station in Lexington reached out and wanted to talk to us. And now we have, I think, just shy of $6,000. Wow. Again, what did I do? I simply amplified a voice. I said, here is a mother who is fighting so hard for her kid. Can you all please help her? So whoever's out there even thinking about doing this sort of work, just find those voices that need lifting up and lift them.
How far beyond your expectations has this gone?
I can't really even answer it. I have not processed what has happened. I think, and also don't know what I expect anymore. So a good example is the day I met President Biden. So we know that we get to meet him as Teachers of the Year, and I'm thinking, what do I say to the president? So the night before, I still hadn't thought of anything. And a father reaches out to me, a man I did not know at all. He just randomly messages me online and tells me that he has a child and his child is trans, and that child, who is 9, wore a rainbow pin to school that day. And it was the first time that child had worn the pin. And he said, we were all so nervous because this is the first time they were sharing this aspect of themselves. So he drops his kid off to school. The kid goes in, and immediately a teacher says, you have to take that off. It's inappropriate. So what the kid hears is, you're inappropriate. And this is the first time this kid's ever tried to share. So this kid was devastated, and the father was devastated. And I thought, you must have no one if you're reaching out to a complete stranger. Probably because I have rainbow glasses and write big gay Appalachian in my profile. So I was like, okay, well, I know I'm going to talk to the president about this. I'm going to be a teacher. This is what teachers do. So like a big goofball, I go to CVS. So we're not allowed to bring anything. But I'm like, this matters more than Secret Service rules. So I buy a card for the kid, write the card, but don't sign it, and think, I'll just get the president of the United States to sign this card. Hide the card in my jacket. Somehow go through security, pass by Secret Service, and get to the president, pull the card out, and then Secret Service is coming towards us. And Dr. Biden puts her hands up as if to say, it's okay. And then I don't even know what I'm saying because I was so nervous. But she says, Willie, is everything we need to know here? And I said, yes, ma'am. And she took the card and she says, I promise I'll take care of this. And then she hands it to a Secret Service agent. And I thought, I'll never hear anything from this because she didn't sign it. About a month later, a package arrives on my doorstep from the White House addressed to this kid. And I have to call the kid's dad. And we actually meet here at UK so that I can hand off. And it's a letter written to this kid from the president. And it's a beautiful letter. And he talks about how so many people assumed because of his speech impediment that he wouldn't be able to do anything great, and how the best things that he would ever do hadn't even happened yet. And so he promised this kid, you have to share yourself because there are parts of yourself you don't even know yet, and they're going to change the world. I mean, how do you anticipate that? And again, I did nothing special but buy a card. But I think, part of the work is just believing something will happen. I think a lot of us have lost a lot of hope that good things will come. But, if you can't at least envision something hopeful, then nothing good will happen. I think our ability to imagine good things happening is 90% of the work here. And it's work that has to happen or else we're not going to have anything good.
Yeah, so on that idea of hope, what gives you more hope for inclusion and equity and belonging in the future? Particularly, say, within schools and universities and maybe just society in general?
I think any and every time I hear someone in a position of power speak about these issues, I'm a little more hopeful. It's a tug of war between forces that subjugate other human beings in order to maintain power and forces that want others to be free and are willing to take on the risk of angering the other force. And when I see someone who doesn't have to do the work, I have to do the work. I'm an LGBTQ person. Black and brown people have to do the work, frankly, because the work is necessary. But when I see someone who's not in that group doing the work, that reminds me that we're being heard. And then secondly, most importantly, is seeing these kids and the work that they're doing. I sat at the Capitol last spring and watched, 24 LGBTQ kids ranging from 13 to 19 speak honestly in front of cameras, in front of crowds of 1,000 about their experiences, while people inside that building voted against their interests and in some cases even mocked them. And despite all that, they still stood strong and spoke. That gives me hope. Seeing just how open-minded this generation is gives me hope. There's a lot of reasons to feel discouraged, but without hope, there's no point in any of the work that we're doing. I think hope is a moral necessity. It is an action sometimes. It's almost like faith, right? Good things must happen because we can't afford good things not happening. So whether or not we believe it in the marrow of our bones that good things are going to happen, we have to act as if they're going to. And that's how these kids sort of affect how I feel about things, just sort of watching them.
I really like that hope as an action, because hope feels like such a passive thing that you just sit back and say, well, I hope this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. But you're saying that it requires some movement, mm-hmm. and that by doing that, you're expecting something good will come of it.
I like the word expect. In Spanish, esperar, to hope, also means to wait. And I like that because it means a much more assured belief that it's going to come to fruition, right? If I'm waiting for my mother, I assume she's coming, so I'll do whatever prep work is going to happen. The English word doesn't carry that assuredness, right? So yeah, I like adding assuredness to hope. And that assuredness means action. If we're hoping for something, then we're preparing for it.
Yeah. I think that speaks to the importance of advocacy and using your voice or amplifying voices, all the things that you've kind of talked about already. So from your, personal and professional experience, what has that taught you about resilience?
I think in some ways it's inevitable. I mean, if you fall, either you never get back up, right? But if you're alive and you anticipate continuing to be alive, it's inevitable. You have to get back up. There are so many things that feel like they're hindrances to resilience, like emotions. They're not really. Emotions are just a sign that something's happening or that something did happen. And I think sometimes we get lost in trying to get rid of the emotion or thinking that the emotion itself is, a meaningful indicator of negativity. But for me, it's not at all. Probably the best change I've made in the last decade is I'm no longer afraid of emotions. I recognize them for what they are. I allow them to be. I don't try to fight them. And I expect that things will get better. I've learned that I think we carry with us in our stories whatever we need to protect us from what's about to come. I think we carry in our stories whatever we need to heal ourselves. And the best work is the work that allows those stories to unfold, that's willing to look at them, that's willing to hear them, that sort of has the courage to enter into a vulnerable space to remember, because in remembering, we find so much. This kid who grew up in Frogtown, Kentucky, was strong enough to get me to college. He was strong enough to get me through college. He was strong enough to be closeted. He was strong enough to spend 4 years in high school hearing anti-gay slurs. Think about adults in a job when their boss doesn't like them or their coworkers don't like them. Most adults will crack in a matter of months, and they're getting paid to be there. And we ask kids to go into spaces that hate them. And we ask kids to do it while being judged on every aspect, whether how they look, how they feel about themselves, how smart they are, how rated they are. And then we act confused when we see the high rates of depression and suicide. And the numbers break down pretty clearly. The more marginalized a person is in terms of their identity, the more likely they are to experience those negative characteristics while in school. So I'm answering in a lot of different ways, but I've learned those people who are going through those experiences have in those experiences what can heal them.
And I think this brings it back sort of full circle to the book. So if you would be willing, would you read a poem from your book that you feel like kind of summarizes either your values or this greater idea of resilience?
I would be an absolute honor to do that. I always joke with my husband, the most awkward part of any sort of speaking engagement that I do is the part where I try to find a page number because I'm so bad at this. So I think if any of these sort of encapsulates that idea, it's this one more than any. I will also preface by saying that I got a message from a pastor in Indiana who said that he was at a funeral recently of a young trans person and that they read this poem at that funeral. It was very hard on me emotionally at first. I never expected that message in my life. And I wrote and said, I can't help but shake this feeling that if I had written other words, maybe you wouldn't be at a funeral. His response was, think of all the people who aren't at funerals right now because they've had access to this. So I'm trying to approach my thinking from that perspective. And it's easy, certainly, to see these young people responding. They're very, very kind. So this is called Promise. Take it from a fat, gay, weird sissy from up the holler. Sometimes you got to cry and let the moon pull the pain-polluted tide out of your body onto the shores of your face so your oceans can be pure again. Sometimes you got to cuss. Got to hurl hot, raging, high-voltage divinations into the air so they can turn tables and set fire to the hills to clear a path for you to keep going. Sometimes you got to mourn and gather together enough time and space to create gravity that wraps its roots deep and intimately around a moment so you can be sure of what was real. So you go ahead and cry, cuss, and mourn, but keep your head pointed towards the sky because this moment will not be the end of you.
Sorry, I just wanted to leave some space in there for the listeners to sort of digest. That was one I had actually flagged, one that I felt was particularly powerful. And hearing it come from the author's mouth just adds that much more sort of weight behind it. I really appreciate you just taking the opportunity just to read one aloud too. I think it's hard sometimes to read a personal story, especially in a poem, because it's hard to know what that author sometimes is intending, and maybe sometimes you don't intend anything, or you're hoping that the reader, in this case, comes to their own conclusions. But yeah, I mean, you can hear it in your voice and what it meant, and a lot of things you've already talked about coming out through that poem there in the 1.5 minutes it takes to read it.
Thank you, first of all. And yeah, there's even been moments where I'm reading one of these out loud. There's a couple of poems where suddenly people will laugh, and I'm like, oh, I don't think I knew that was funny. But consistently, I get the same reaction in a specific line. So it's, communication involves two people, and when you're writing, there's an intended audience that you sort of imagine in your head. But I love watching people respond, because I learn things that I didn't even realize I was doing.
Yeah. So how can our listeners, my colleagues, and myself be more inclusive and better, more effective allies to the queer community, particularly within the University of Kentucky?
I think this is true for any sort of allyship work that you're doing. The single most important thing is to recognize that you are going to make mistakes and let yourself make them so that you can be involved. What I notice is so many people are so terrified of making a mistake that is probably the number one reason that a would-be ally is afraid to be an ally. So I don't know, maybe they're afraid of saying the wrong word, or maybe they're afraid of making a joke that might hurt someone's feelings. But what I would say is, when I'm working with someone who might, I don't know, say something that isn't exactly right, all I see is someone who's on a path to getting better. I am on a path to getting better. I'm not trans, so I don't really understand in my heart of hearts what it means to be trans, but I understand in my heart of hearts what it means to be seeking a space. And I understand in my heart of hearts how important it is to have people who aren't me articulate my needs. So I learn and make mistakes as I'm going. Secondly is find the work that people are already doing and amplify it. We don't really even have to reinvent the wheel. There's such great organizations in Kentucky. These groups are really sort of doing on the ground work to help. So seek out those groups, see the trainings that they've already built, and don't be afraid to engage.
Are there any communities or groups within the university that you would recommend people seeking out to either learn more or get involved?
Certainly, the LGBTQ Center on campus is a fantastic space. And what I would say is, when we have students who come to Gatton, we always say, yes, you're a UK student, but you're a Gatton student. So I would say wherever a person at UK is located, figure out what space exists where you are. And if it doesn't exist, ask people who would be interested in helping you make it. We are currently developing a space here in Gatton for minoritized student groups to come together and do work for themselves and with other people. And it's really important to have some form of messaging. We have to remember the lens that other people use to see the world. So that lens is not going to be universal for LGBTQ people, but my lens is, until someone signals to me that they are pro-LGBTQ, my assumption, in order for me to be safe, is going to be that they're not. So if you work in a space that doesn't have signaling for students, there's going to be a lot of students who are going to work from the assumption that you're hostile. And again, if they don't work from that assumption, then they could potentially find themselves interacting with someone hostile who might harm them, because there are people who would harm them. So I would ask, find ways to do signaling to let people know that you want to support.
So we've gotten to our conclusion area. So this is where our rapid fire type of questions will go. So I have a deck of table topics. So I'll pull one at random and then we'll each answer it. So completely unknown to either one of us. Who's the funniest person alive?
You go first.
Oh, that's really hard. Seems like such a simple question. I always struggle with any one of these.
Yeah. I will say, whoever is doing the primary writing for Dairy Girls, I don't know if you've seen it. It's a show that is currently, it calls it a Netflix original, but you know that they just purchased it from some other thing. But the primary writer is also the primary actress. And It is the single wittiest thing, period, I've ever seen. They only release 6 or 7 episodes per season, but there's not a single missed moment. The humor is both in your face and subtle. The pacing is perfect. I think her name is Lisa McGee, actually. But single funniest human being alive, I do think.
Yeah. Humor is actually one of my values. So that I think this is why I'm struggling so hard with it, because I have so many examples of like the Jim Carreys and the Adam Sandlers and like people like that I grew up on. Steve Martin is one that it's coming to mind for me. But I'm going to go a really off the wall example. And the person who is running social media for the national parks has to be, I'm assuming, one of the funniest people to be around in person. And I don't know that person gets enough credit. I don't know if you've seen the social media accounts for the national parks, but they are just constantly hilarious, but also using humor to educate. Every time I scroll past and see one, I just like give like a hearty, chuckle. That like somebody like came up with this sort of witty or creative way to keep us from getting eaten by bears, basically. So yeah, I will say that one is my kind of off the wall answer and give somebody more behind the scenes some credit.
I love that. I was at a state park I was a panel at a conference recently, and they had run off photocopies reminding people that there were lots of bears in the area and sort of what not to do, like don't feed a bear, don't try to pet a bear. But they had accidentally photocopied instructions for the workers on the back. And there were things like, do not make comments like, I wish they'd do something about these bears, or these bears are really annoying. And there was like a whole list of phrases that I could picture someone saying. But I want to meet whoever sat down and tried to imagine banter between someone checking someone in at a hotel and the person doing the checking in, and banter specifically around bears that might turn negative. Because they had every example, like 30 of them, like, these bears sure do annoy me, or I'm tired of these bears. Like, no negative bear anything from parks.
That's good, yeah. The sort of hilarity of everyday moments in life and the things you could encounter. I'm sure somebody probably had a little bit of fun, or somebody who had to review that list probably had a little bit of fun getting to that end of the list. All right. What song brings about resilience in your life?
Freedom 90 by George Michael, more so than any other song. It's so rare to like happen upon it, but it can completely shift my mood if I just happen upon that song. But it is simultaneously a song written for other people because he wants us obviously to enjoy the music, but it's also a declaration that he belongs to no one, that he is entirely free in the universe. And I love it for that reason.
Yeah, that's a good one. So we have a Wildly Resilient playlist that you can find on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube Music. So that one will be added up this month.
Yay.
Who at UK would you like to give a shout out to? So moment of appreciation.
Stephanie Lynch. She is the supervisor of academic advisors in the URC. And she is so supportive of just the advocacy work that I'm doing. So understanding if I say, hey, can I don't know, finish Tuesday from a library in Louisville because I'm doing a podcast. And she has come to so many events that I'm doing and checks in so often. And I think she's a good reminder that if you find a high functioning place on this campus where people are happy and doing their jobs more than effectively, there's likely someone directing them, making decisions with them and for them, listening to them, who makes it that functional. So for sure, shout out to her.
And with the time that you have, obviously you're very busy. We have already discussed that. So what is your go-to self-care move in those times of stress or just when you need to recharge?
I wish I could say something, really dramatic and poignant, like I sit on a rock or go into the sun. But there is a YouTuber named Charlotte Dobray. She is a Canadian who basically comments on videos that other people make, who I guess she's popular because she's pretty in a non-threatening sort of way. But I mean, she's not I think she would also agree with this assessment. It's not as if she's the wittiest human being on earth. It's not as if she's the most insightful. She is just a regular human being, but her comments are always on the side of goodness. And there's something about just not having to think, just sort of lying there comatose, watching her comment on things and knowing that she's not going to say anything offensive. That is super addictive. It lets me feel faith in humanity.
Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. I've watched quite a few of those videos in the past, and it is always very well and sort of tastefully done.
Well, it's so goofy. Like my husband, like it'll be like 25 Karens who attack.
Yeah.
And my husband will be like, how can you watch this and not get more stressed? And I'm like, well, because I know that there's going to be some random awful people. It's her response to it. Her response is disarming, but yeah, he doesn't get it.
Yeah. All right, last word. What's the one message you want to leave listeners with from this conversation?
You matter. You matter so much. And I know that seems sort of teachery, but you know, I've had 3,000 students in the state of Kentucky. And what I've learned about humanity, seeing 3,000 people pass through my classroom at the most vulnerable part of their lives, is that deep down, a lot of people truly don't believe in themselves. They think that if other people see what they really are, they will laugh or be disappointed. And I don't know, I'm so many negative potential stereotypes as a fat, gay Appalachian sissy, but I love myself. I think I matter. And in doing that, I actually realized how much other people matter as well. So I would say to anyone out there who wouldn't do a goofy dance in front of 50 people, figure out what they see when they look at you and try to see yourself that way.
I like that a lot. Well, thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing your story. Thanks for sharing your book. Thanks for sharing your time. I truly, truly appreciate me being on here and sharing a message about hope and about resilience and just all that you've shared with us, and advocacy and everything else too. So I'll leave you with one more thank you.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed every minute of this. I'm so grateful to have been on.
And now it's time for my wrap up and announcement. I love what Willie had to share in our conversation, especially around the importance of self-compassion, empathy, and using your unique voice. I also found his acknowledgement of the assumptions we make to be helpful. So I encourage you to do a few things. First, check out Willie's book, Gay Poems for Red States. You don't have to identify with any parts of his identity to take something from it. Second, identify one way you can be a better ally or advocate for others. Maybe that's amplifying voices, maybe that's signaling safety or belonging, or maybe it's volunteering. Finally, tell someone they matter this week. You never know who really needs to hear it in any given moment, so share it freely. You can find everything we mentioned in the show notes, so be sure to check those out when you're done listening. As for the announcement that I teased earlier, this will be my final episode as host of Becoming Wildly Resilient, as I'm moving on to a new position within the UK College of Education at the end of August. However, this will not be the end of Becoming Wildly Resilient. My colleagues Amy Rodquist-Cadet and Jackie Carroll will be taking over in September to provide you with tools, practices, mindsets, and meditations each month. Amy will kick off each month with a brief description of a tool, practice, or mindset to try. Jackie will follow up with a guided meditation or reflection in the middle of each month. Then, starting around the new year, the goal is to bring back long-form conversations with a new host, eventually giving you 3 distinct episodes each month. So be sure to hit the follow button in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss what's to come. While I'll miss hosting the podcast and working with my wonderful teammates in HR Health and Wellness, I'm excited to see how they take it from here. I have thoroughly enjoyed hosting Becoming Wildly Resilient for the past 3 years, and I've learned so much from the 38 guests from 17 different colleges or divisions across the university. So I want to thank them so much for joining me on this journey. And I also can't thank you enough for joining me on this journey as well. Without you, I would not have been able to do this for so long. I hope it served, inspired, and enlightened you as much as it did me. So as I wrap up for the last time, I want to leave you with two things. First, my hope is that you recognize just how much we need each other. It's essential to our resilience and overall well-being. With that, I'm adding one more song to the Wildly Resilient playlist. You've Got a Friend in Me by Randy Newman from the Toy Story franchise. Those movies are all about the inevitability and challenge of change, which we get through together. So know that you've got a friend in me. And the second thing I want to leave you with is to continue to be curious, or as Ted Lasso exclaims in the show of the same name, be curious, not judgmental. Ask questions, challenge your assumptions or old ways of thinking, tap into your childlike wonder, listen and learn, but remember to do it from a place of openness and compassion. That's it. Thank you again for the honor of hosting this podcast. As always, take care of yourself and others, and stay well. Thank you for listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient. This podcast is brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. We offer a wide range of online and in-person services to support the well-being of UK employees, retirees, and their spouses. You can find experts in mental health, personal resilience, nutrition, and physical activity ready to meet you where you are and address your unique needs. To learn more about the work-life and well-being services offered by UK Human Resources, visit hr.uky.edu/wellbeing. You can also connect with us on social media and YouTube by searching @UKY Wellness or by email at healthandwellness@uky.edu.